this is probably.
Hey folks, welcome back to Ken Michaels Radio. Here on the channel, I am enjoying all this time that I'm spending with you and with my guests talking about the Beatles. And we could talk about anything, the group years, the solo years, any part of their history, any part of their music, and I'm loving every single minute of it. My special guest this time is Glenn Greenberg, and you may be aware, keep this to yourself, folks. Paul McCartney just had an 80th birthday. Keep it to yourself. Only we know about it. Actually, it's been getting a lot of attention, and Time magazine just put out a special collector's issue, Paul McCartney at 80, and Glenn is the author of it. It's a good overview of Paul's entire career, his childhood, his parents, his family, the Beatles, his solo career, Wings, you name it, up until today. And we welcome Glenn to Ken Michaels Radio.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
I must say before we start that I became aware of, well, this issue. I mean, eventually I would have found out anyway, through Matt Williamson's channel, Pop Goes the 60s, and you did a great interview with him. And I really enjoyed the show, and I found it to be really captivating and a lot of stuff that I wanted to talk about. So I knew I had to get in touch with you.
I'm glad you did.
But I think we're just going to go in whatever direction this takes you, because the Beatles, any one of the Beatles, are such fascinating people. And I'd like to start the conversation with a potentially dangerous question, only because it can go into a lot of different directions. But after being such a big part of our lives as a public figure for 60 years, depending upon how old you are, could be up to 60 years, do you feel you really know who Paul McCartney is? Is it so simple? Is the image that he projects to the world all there really is to him? Or is he a much more complicated figure, in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly the Paul that he wants us to know, which is the nice, affable, down to earth, feet on the ground Paul, just a hardworking, bloke from Liverpool, who has great musical talent and just made a lot of money using that talent. And obviously there's a lot to that. I mean, that is, I think, to the core who he is. But if you read comments from the people who knew him as a child, who knew him when he was on the way up, who knew him after he made it, people who worked with him, people who worked for him, you get a lot of different layers, and you get a lot of different dimensions that he wouldn't necessarily want out there or admit to. I mean, but we're all like that to a great extent. We're always putting or at least most of us put our best faces out there for the world to see. Right. I don't know if I would call Paul complicated. I would call him complex. I would also call him remarkably consistent. Who he's been since, I would say, from the moment he began his solo career, when he wasn't part of this four-headed monster, as they used to be known. He's been remarkably consistent, and there aren't a lot of contradictions with him, which is kind of refreshing. But I don't think the public persona is all there is to him. No way. Simply just because there are certain ways that he portrays himself, where it's been fundamentally shown that that's not necessarily, or that's not the entirety of who he is. We can go into examples. The first example I can give you is, he talks about how collaborative he is and how much he loves, getting feedback from people and getting their input and learning from them. And we also know that there's a pattern with him is, if he brings in something to the studio that say a collaborator or a producer doesn't like, he's got like this knee-jerk reaction to say, well, how many #1 hits have you written? you know, and he does it with that sort of like, you know, affable kind of, but there's an edge to it, you know, and the message is, listen, don't tell me how to do this, you know, which kind of takes away from the whole, I want to just collaborate with people thing, you know, if people, you know, if you're going to intimidate people and you're Paul McCartney, people are going to be intimidated, you know, unless you get somebody like, say, an Elvis Costello who has a similar background and can just say, well, you know, piss off, you know, that kind of thing,
Right.
and stand up to him. But there's a long track record. I mean, you know, from I believe it was Hugh Padgham, when he was working on Press to Play, all the way up to, I mean, he would talk back to George Martin, you know, so there isn't that openness to criticism and collaboration as much as I think Paul either wants us to believe or even believes himself, you know.
Well,
So
I think
yeah,
a lot depends upon who you talk to about
yeah,
it. Because
hmm
I've interviewed a lot of people in my career where the Beatles are concerned. I've interviewed most of the members of Wings.
okay,
And on the one hand, you'll get somebody like Lawrence Juber, who will tell you that if he has an idea for a Wings song and he presents it to Paul and Paul likes it, he'll go with it.
oh
And then
sure,
there are times when Paul has very definite ideas as to what he wants.
hmm
And there's nothing wrong with that. That's how a lot of creative people are. They think, you know, the song is very close to them and they have ideas brimming all the time in their brain. And sometimes they have very exact ideas as to what they want, but there are times when they accept ideas from other people.
hmm
On the other hand, classic story is what happened with Henry McCullough.
yeah,
And Paul loved the guitar solo on My
I
Love
love,
and praised it. And it's great to praise him, but he wanted Henry to play it the same way every single time.
right, right,
So for someone who's a much more organic player like Henry is, that goes against the grain.
yeah,
So, you know, it works both ways, you know, and I'm sure that a lot of artists are that way, where they have very exact ideas as to how they want their music to go. But I do think that at the same time, Paul likes to get input from other people. And that's probably why he's worked with a lot of producers, especially from the 80s on up.
hmm
So I think that there's some truth to that. It's not, you know, black and white. Paul just wants it his way all the time, but I'm sure there's a part of him that thinks he's had all this much success. He must know what he's doing, you know, if he's had this kind of success before.
sure. I mean, it seems to me like this was more along the lines when he was in kind of that fallow period going into the mid 80s, you know, where the hits weren't exactly coming, and he was kind of like, you know, scrambling around trying to sort of get his groove back. And you know, I in particular, the guy, I think it was again Hugh Padgham,
Hmm.
has some has some real indelible memories about working with Paul on that one particular album. I think it was Press to Play, and
Hey,
uh, yeah.
Glenn, this shirt is a press to play shirt.
Oh, that's right.
That's
That's
like the mixing board.
the mixing board. Yeah, right. Yeah. I remember. Boy, wow, that's cool.
Yeah. I've kept
That's
it ever since the album came out. I barely can fit into it, but you can't see how the rest of me looks on this,
I
on
didn't
the screen.
I didn't know there was a T-shirt. That's brilliant.
Yeah,
That's
it's
really
a
brilliant.
promotional t-shirt for press.
Oh, that's terrific.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm a
So
major fan of that album. So just so you know.
I bought it the week it came out.
Hmm.
So yeah. And that was I was just let's see. I was finally in a position where I had spent my own spending money. I was old enough to have my own spending money, and I could buy whatever I wanted. And that was one of the things that I bought as soon as it came out. So I have fond memories of bringing it home and listening to it and experiencing it for the first time, and reading some great interviews that Paul did for, you know, to promote the film, to promote the album. Great interview with Rolling Stone. I remember that I still remember quotes from that interview.
Mhm.
It was such a great interview. But anyway, I think that I don't know if I'd say that he's complicated. I would say that he's complex. and for the most part, remarkably consistent in who he is.
Uh-huh.
And I think that the way he presents himself is certainly a fraction of who he is. It's not the whole picture. But I think there is a genuine affability to him, a genuine interest in other people, and enjoying the adulation that he gets when people give it to him.
Mhm.
And I think that is I think he has bad days just as everybody, and bad moments just as everybody else. I mean, some of his moments have been captured, by the press and so forth. But I think for the most part, that is who he is. I think that's a major part of who he is.
Yeah, sometimes I just have a real difficult time trying to figure him out. And
Okay.
it's just, you know what it's like? You spend so many years. I've been doing Beatles radio programs for 40 years now. I've read so many books.
Right.
I've watched so many interviews. I feel in some ways like I know these people.
Mhm.
And yet, of all the Beatles, sometimes I feel like I know Paul the least,
Mm.
because there's so many different sides to him that I don't fully understand. Like, for example,
Okay.
he goes through all this trouble of putting out archival box sets, and in many cases does a lot of great work on them. Wonderful photo books with Linda's photos in there. And he shows pride in these albums that he's made since the Beatles. And yet, when you see him in concert, it's like 60% Beatles music.
Right.
And he doesn't address the archival box sets. He does nothing about the anniversaries for any of these albums. If an album like Tug of War, celebrates an anniversary like it just did,
His 40th
okay,
anniversary.
yeah, he doesn't do a few songs. He's done Here Today
Right.
quite a long time, but he doesn't do anything about it. Instead, he gives the people, I guess, what he thinks what they want by playing a lot of Beatles stuff and not showing pride in what he did after the Beatles. Now, the thing that bothers me the most is that there's a lot of reasons why I love the Beatles, but what impresses me so much as someone who listened to radio from the 60s on up, I followed the charts, I saw the success that all four of them had. There isn't any musician on this planet that wouldn't give their teeth to have the kind of success that Paul McCartney had on his own.
Mhm.
Forget about the Beatles for a second.
Right. Right.
And yet, you know, when Paul talks now in interviews and also in concert, it's almost always about the Beatles.
Yeah. Yeah. Even when he's not asked about it,
Right.
he weaves it into the conversation. I think a lot of it is well, you kind of touched upon it, is he thinks that's what the people want to hear about, and he wants to give the people what they want, what he thinks they want. I personally, I mean, and the funny thing is, obviously there was that time in the 70s where he didn't play any Beatles songs in concert.
Right.
And he didn't want to talk about the Beatles in his interviews. He wanted to talk about what he was doing then and there. Uh, Obviously, there was a break. I think the death of John had a lot to do with it. And I think nowadays, I mean, I get into this a little bit in my book. I think he sees himself as, even though Ringo is out there and Ringo does a great job and we all love Ringo and all that, but Ringo's not Paul. Ringo was not, if there's a tier of being in the Beatles, much to George's chagrin, he and Ringo were in the second tier.
Right.
And with John gone, Paul is basically the living embodiment of the Beatles. And so I think it's important to him to keep that flame alive. And I think that's as much a part of it as just trying to please people. Me, I mean, I've seen him in concert. Since 1989, I've seen him in concert about 5 to 7 times. There's a ton of songs that I would love to have seen him play.
Mhm.
That he's never. And here's the funny thing: if you go on YouTube, you'll see that he'll play them in, like, Brazil or Europe, and I want to see them too. But in his mind, those songs just won't play to American audiences. I think he's wrong, but he's got his own way of determining this stuff. I've never seen him do Junior's Farm. I would love
In
to
this
see.
story, he has.
Oh well, but I haven't
Yeah.
seen Paul. Okay, well, fine. He worked it in after I'm done seeing him. So there you go.
Actually, right before COVID, when
Yeah.
he toured to promote Egypt Station, he
Mhm.
was doing Junior's Farm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I've outlived my usefulness in terms of that, because it's gotten to a point where I just don't really go to too many concerts as it is. They've gotten very expensive.
Hmm.
And I kind of got tired of seeing, the same set lists over and over and over. I don't see the Who anymore either. For pretty much the same reason. They're touring now too, around now. That's great that he's finally doing Junior's Farm. I wish he had done it one of the 5 to 7 times that I've already seen him. Venus and Mars, rock show. Would have loved to have seen him do that. Part of the reason why I stopped going is because for the most part, it was just the same stuff over and over and over again.
Right.
There was no excitement. So I'm glad that he's doing it now. It's too late for me. But anyway, I do agree. He does lean heavily towards the Beatles stuff. I thought it was weird when I saw him doing I've Got a Feeling with this current band. I don't want to hear somebody else singing John's part. That's just weird to me,
Well, now he's mixing in the footage from Get Back. They've isolated John's vocals and they're featuring that with John on camera.
Right. That's what he's doing on this tour. I have seen the video of that, but I know that at one point he was doing I've Got a Feeling with one of his band members doing the John part, which
Right.
that didn't ring right to me. I'm glad he's doing this now, the way he's doing it now. That was really great. And that's probably the best way to do it in this day and age. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was frustrating, or it has been frustrating to see, these various interviews with him over the last few years, and you'll be talking about just anything not to do with the Beatles, and he'll find a way to just kind of work John in there somehow. So it feels almost obligatory.
And I feel that way about the lyrics book that came out,
Which I've read. I have it. Yeah.
There are times when he's discussing a solo song, and for some reason he tries to relate it to something that happened in the Beatles.
I mean, I have a hard time believing that John has weighed so heavily on his mind and was such an influence on him, 10, 15 years after the Beatles broke up, and that he's still constantly always thinking about John. I mean, they weren't particularly close at the time of John's death. They were on good terms.
Right.
We know that, but it's not like they were, in each other's lives to such an extent that John would still be on his mind all the time. And he likes to present it as if he is.
No, but the thing is, and it's taken me a long time to realize this, that, the Beatles, like a lot of bands, were not just a great group or a great band. They were a family.
Right.
They went through so much together, and they knew each other from a very young age. So many life's experiences they went through together. It wasn't just the music. They did everything together. They were in each other's pockets for a long time. So, so much of what Paul experiences in life, he could bring back to something that he did in the Beatles. But at the same time, it's like I look at him now and I admire him so much for his entire body of work. And he's only a Beatle. It seems like in his mind, that's how the world probably sees him. That's all he's going to talk about. When you see him in concert, he'll do his tribute to John. He'll do his tribute to George. He mentions George Martin when he goes into Love Me Do. It's sort of a tribute to George Martin. What about anybody else that he's worked with after 1970?
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have to have passed away for Paul to mention them. What about ever bringing up Denny Lane? 10
Mm-hmm.
years he worked with the man.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you look at the lyrics book, and the one thing that really bothers me the most is that, you know, when he's writing with you'd never think he wrote with anybody else other than John
But
Lennon.
John. Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
there's one mention of Carl Davis for the Liverpool Oratorio,
Mm-hmm.
but nothing about Denny Lane, even though Mullet Kintyre is one of the songs that he does talk about.
Right.
He doesn't talk about Denny's contribution.
Right.
He doesn't talk about, well, there's no Elvis Costello song in there that he wrote with Elvis.
Which was a major source of disappointment to me,
Yeah.
because some of my favorite McCartney songs are the songs that he wrote with Elvis Costello.
Hmm.
In fact, probably my favorite of the whole bunch is one that a lot of people probably don't even know about because it was never properly recorded, which is Tommy's Coming Home.
Sure.
It's a beautiful song, and I can't believe that he didn't put that out. He didn't put. Well, he has put out the demo
Right.
in recent years, but
Yeah.
that wasn't one of the ones that made it out in that initial flush of songs that they did together.
Right. Two demos, actually.
Yeah, the first one is much better.
Well, I love hearing just Paul and Elvis on acoustic guitars.
Wasn't it brilliant? Just brilliant. I mean, it's fantastic.
Yeah, I mentioned this in my previous interview. 20 Fine Fingers.
That's a good one.
Come on, that's a real good one.
That's a good one.
Gone out there.
Yeah. But
Yeah,
I don't know why that didn't make it into the lyrics book. I'm sorry, that none of the songs, My Brave Face, I don't know why that didn't make it in, or Mistress and Maid. Yeah, it was weird to me that just, you know, he just bypassed it. I don't know. I mean, that mystifies me too.
Yeah, and as someone who loves this album here, I
Mhm.
like the songs he wrote with Eric Stewart a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I wish that he had done more with Eric Stewart.
Mm-hmm.
There is one song in the book that's Pretty Little Head. No
Mm-hmm.
mention of Eric and what he contributed.
Wow.
You know, it's really bizarre to me. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, this is the image that he's projecting of himself.
Mm-hmm.
You know, why doesn't he want to include all these other key figures in his career?
Mm.
It's only the Beatle people.
Yeah.
It's only from
Yeah.
that period.
Yeah.
It's bizarre.
I think, you know, I don't want to play armchair psychiatrist,
Yeah.
but I think I mean, the Beatles broke up 52 years ago.
Right.
And for most of those 52 years, that's all anybody has wanted to talk to him about. And I think he's like been psychologically conditioned at this point to just sort of, you know, give the people what they want, or what he thinks they want. And I think that's you know, it's you know, it's funny when you talk to a lot of different celebrities, especially when they've been at this for a long time, they've kind of fallen into a pattern, and they've got like ready-made answers
Mhm.
for no matter what the question is. You can be asking them, you know, something completely different, and they'll manage to weave back to their standard, you know, template answer. And I think that's also part of where he may be at this point, you know. I find it frustrating, just because I'd love to see him talk about new things that he hasn't talked about a million
Right.
times before.
But, you know, on the flip side of that, you know, I've been guilty of criticizing Paul because he keeps repeating the same stories over and over
Mhm.
again, not only on Beatles songs, but even in concert. It's
Mhm.
the same shtick over and
Right.
over again.
Mhm.
But then again, if he presents something entirely new
Mhm.
about the same songs, then there are people that question, why are you saying this so much later now? Why is it taking you 50 years to tell these stories?
Mhm.
You know, like Eleanor Rigby, you know, he
Mhm.
talks about how when he was, I guess in his teens, he used to go to this old woman's house and do errands for her. I never heard him say that before.
Mhm. Mhm.
Why is it taking you all these years to bring that up?
Right.
You know? So, I mean,
It may not be true. You
well,
know?
I really believe that deep down that Paul is a very genuine, honest person.
Mhm.
But I think historically, once in a while, he'll forget certain things. He's human
Yeah,
like everybody else.
absolutely.
He did so much during the Beatle years in a very short period of time. How can anybody remember everything
Right,
that happened in a compressed period of time like that?
right, right.
So, yeah, and then he'll turn around and write a song like Early Days.
Hmm.
I understand why he wrote it. You know, this
Hmm.
little girl told him the story about something that happened in the Beatles, and then Paul tried to correct the girl, and she told him that he's wrong.
Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
that there are people who think they know more about him or about the Beatles than he does.
Right.
So, you know, that's kind of insulting, and that I can understand why he'd write a song like Early Days for that
Sure.
matter.
Sure.
But at the same time, there's no way he can remember every single thing that
Right.
happened to him in his life. He's accomplished so much. But he's a baffling person in a lot of ways. And yet at the same time, I do believe that every time he gives interviews, for the most part, he's honest. I think he's a very kind, gentle soul. And I
Hmm.
think he tells you his story as he remembered it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I said it may not be true, I don't mean that he's lying. I've said it may not actually be factually uh, uh, accurate. Maybe accurate is the word I should have used.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, I guess you would call it revisionism, and I think some of that is in reaction to the perception that people have had about him pretty much since the Beatles broke up, which I get into in my book. You know, he had to deal with a lot of slings and arrows,
Hmm.
um, because of the misconception and the wrong perception that he was the one who broke up the band, and a lot of people resented him for
Hmm.
breaking up the band, which was patently untrue. Why did he get the blame? Because John blamed him in that infamous 1970 Rolling Stone interview.
Right.
Uh, why was there so much negativity aimed at his music? Because influential publications like Rolling Stone picked sides in the feud and did whatever they could to sink, to basically kill Paul's solo career in the crib.
Right.
And it was tactical. Um, we now know that uh, the review for McCartney, the first McCartney solo album,
Hmm.
McCartney, whoever reviewed it gave it a positive review, and because Jan Wenner uh, was pissed off at Paul because he was offended by the Q&A that Paul
Oh,
inserted into the album.
yeah.
That offended Jan Wenner, and he also wanted to stay in John's good graces. So he pressured the reviewer to change the positive review to a much more negative one. And then they went after Paul with Ram also. So you've got McCartney was criticized for being kind of very homemade and rough and sounding very unfinished and rough. So he goes in to make Ram, which is much more polished and much more of the quality that you would hear from like Abbey Road and such.
Right.
And they savage, and Rolling Stone and the other critics savage that one too. So Paul is like, "What do you guys want from me?" And the answer was they wanted him to go away. They were Leninistas. And so there's a lot. I think that was very formative for him. Yeah, he was sure he had been in the Beatles, but this was a very fragile period for him where he was really trying to find himself.
Right.
And here he was just getting knocked left and right for not basically, being John Lennon, for just wanting to put out the kind of music that he wants to put out. And no, he doesn't want to dress up in army fatigues and go like this and
Hmm.
curse out the cops or whatever. He just
Uh-huh.
wanted to make happy music, and he was attacked for it.
And ironically, now people have come to realize that a lot of his early solo stuff is really much better than they realized.
Oh
Or
yeah.
actually, a lot of fans liked it to begin with. A
Mhm.
lot of the fans, it commercially, it did
They
very well.
they did well. Yeah.
I mean, the McCartney album went to #1 in America, which a lot of people get wrong. They say All Things Must Pass was the first #1 album
Hmm. Hmm.
from a solo Beatle, but it really was McCartney. And Ram went to #2. So I would hardly call those failures
Mhm.
commercially.
Right.
His fans liked it, but the
Mhm.
critics, I don't know why they had to take sides, really. But that carried over for a long time. In
It did.
fact, I don't even know if you know this, but after John was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Jan Wenner wanted, well, yeah, Jan Wenner asked Paul to do the induction.
To induct John and said he would get in the next year,
Yeah,
and
and
then screwed him
instead,
over.
he
Yeah.
made him wait 5 years before.
After Linda died,
Yeah.
which was just, yeah. Yeah. In my research for this book, I learned a lot about the relationship or lack thereof between Rolling Stone and McCartney, and I was actually kind of appalled. For me, it was like learning that there's no Santa Claus, because I grew up loving Rolling Stone. I considered it the publication of record for the rock generation, you know.
Right.
And if it ran in Rolling Stone, I believed it, you know, the hook, line, and sinker. And as a teen growing up in the 80s, and going into the early 90s, I don't remember how I got my hands on it, but I got my hands on the reviews for the first couple of McCartney solo albums. And the reviews were so negative that I avoided getting those albums for years. And so you get into the early to mid 90s, and I was working in Manhattan, and I was at Tower Records, you know, the late
Mhm.
lamented Tower
Oh,
Records.
I miss them.
Me too, in Soho. And I saw McCartney and Ram available on CD. And I was like, you know what the hell? Let me give it a shot. So I bought them both,
Hmm.
went home and listened to them, and I was like, I denied myself these two albums for all of these years. What? Because Rolling Stone said so.
Right.
And that was the first kind of crack in the veneer, that maybe Rolling Stone isn't all it's chalked up to be. And then I found out just recently what was motivating those reviews. But those reviews kept me from listening to McCartney and Ram for years, you
Yeah.
know. And I'm you know I lost a lot of years where I could have been listening to those songs. I've been trying to make up for lost time. But it just goes to show you the effect that had. And I can see why he's a bit defensive, and I can see why he wants to get his version of the events out there.
Right. And then there are some fans who are more Lennon fans who resent this because
Right.
John's not here to answer back, as if Paul shouldn't be allowed to say anything.
Right. Yeah. I don't give too much credence to to that argument. John.
Not only that, George isn't here to answer back. So
Right. But you know what? It's not like Paul was a silent Sam the entire time that they were alive either. I
mhm.
mean, Paul has given, pretty soul-bearing interviews going back to the 70s. And that's when I say he's been consistent, he's been fairly consistent all these years. And a lot of what he's saying now, go back to the Beatles anthology. Go back to the Barry Miles book many years from now.
Uh-huh.
That's all the stuff. It's consistent within what's in those books. And George was alive back then. I don't recall recently him saying anything about George, one way or the other, that was a startling revelation to me. That he wouldn't have said while George was still alive.
Okay. But didn't you also say a while back that he's a revisionist?
Of certain songs. I mean, he's revisionist. Did I say he's a revisionist?
I know you used the word. I'm
Oh.
trying to think if you use it in the context of Paul himself being a revisionist.
I don't think I did. If I did, then I misspoke, because that's not how I see him.
Okay.
I don't see him as a revisionist. I see him as having the chance to tell his side of the story now.
Right.
But like I said, it's not like it. None of this stuff is a real revelation to me, because I've been reading interviews from him dating back to the 70s, and nothing is all that, you know, like, okay. So for example, if he'll talk about the inspiration of a song, maybe that won't be consistent with what he said before. But again, I don't consider that him being a revisionist of, you know, the holy Beatles history, you know, which is the term that I think of revisionist as almost a pejorative term. I don't use that with regards to Paul and the stuff that he says in interviews now.
Yeah. Well, there are some fans who think, because every now and then you'll get the impression that Paul's taking credit for certain songs that John wrote, you know, and for years we never heard that he had any part
Right.
in certain songs, like Being for the Benefit of Mr. Kite, which he's been doing in concert.
Right.
You know, Paul never said it was a 50-50,
Mhm.
but he said that he pulled the words from the circus poster with John for the song. He didn't say
Right.
how much he contributed, but you know, some fans get up in arms over these
Mhm.
things.
That I know that he's been doing that in his more recent concerts. It baffles me. I don't have an explanation for it. I have theories, but I think, you know, again, this let me stress that this is all very theoretical. Okay. Um, there are things that Paul has not been able to talk about for many, many years because of the internal relationships between the Beatles and their estates
Mhm.
for all these years. Things are changing just because time is marching on, and certain people are not as vital and as not as involved as they used to be. And that has freed Paul up to say things that I get the impression he's wanted to say for many, many years.
Right.
I know that for a fact. He just you know, going back a bunch of years, there was an interview where he stopped himself because I'm not sure I'm able to talk about this.
Mhm.
And then recently he said, well, I'm able to talk about this now. You know, I'm talking like decades apart. And I think that might have something to do with it. The other theory that I have is he's 80 years old.
Mhm.
I mean, at that point, if memory's not playing tricks on you, God bless you. But, you know, I mean, he's 80 years old.
Uh-huh.
And, you know, I don't know how much we're supposed to take with a grain of salt. Maybe reality is somewhere in the middle. But I do know that there are lots of things that he has wanted to either, you know, get credit for, or, you know, claim equal credit, or just talk about in a more forthcoming way. And whatever agreements were in place between him and the other vested interests in Apple Corps, he wasn't able to, you know. You know, just as a for an example, I mean, I know Yoko for many, many years wanted it out there that the way the Beatles got their name was because John had a vision of a man on a flaming pie and said, and you shall be Beatles with, you know, with an E and an A.
Right.
And that was an article that he wrote as a goof
Right.
for his friend's magazine or newspaper. And Yoko wasn't even there at the time.
Right.
She wasn't anywhere. So they were, you know, the other Beatles were like, that's not how we got our name. And
Right.
she insisted that it was. And so he had to, like, you know, keep his mouth shut and dance around it by writing a song that kind of poked fun at that.
Uh-huh.
But he, you know, just couldn't come. But stuff like that is stuff that he's had to deal with over the years. And I think
Yeah.
maybe now he just feels liberated to just say, you know what are you going to do at this point? Come, you know, what do you sue me? Come on.
But you know, when it comes to the Beatles songs, though,
Mhm,
I was kind of hoping in the lyrics book he would spell it out.
right,
This is what I wrote. This is what John wrote.
right,
You know, A Hard Day's Night is a song that most people look at as being a John song.
right.
And I personally believe that the bridge there that Paul sings is probably what Paul wrote. And
Hmm.
the rest was all John. I wasn't there. I don't know. But
Hmm.
Paul doesn't say anything about it in the book.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So he leaves you guessing. So that's the kind of thing Ticket to Ride, he takes credit for. You know, I know that he helped out with the drum pattern that Ringo played. That was Paul's idea, but how much of the song did he write, the composition?
Right.
You know, he doesn't tell you.
Well,
So,
I mean, I grew up uh, uh, just living by, when it comes to this topic, taking the Playboy interview that
right.
John did in 1980 and the Playboy interview that Paul and Linda did in 1984, and just kind of, you know, looking for inconsistencies, you know, and for the most part, they kind of agreed with each other. Now, if what Paul is saying is true, now that kind of upends those two interviews. You know what I mean?
There's
So
also
I don't.
Many Years From Now, the Barry Miles book that I use as a reference.
Right, me too. And that's consistent with the Playboy interview.
Hmm.
So I don't know. I don't know what, when he contradicts himself, when he contradicts all that now, I don't know where it's coming from. Like I said, I have my theories. Until somebody can produce hard and fast evidence, I would default to those Playboy interviews and just stick with that, because otherwise it just gets too confusing. It just does. I mean,
Yeah.
it just, you know, I don't have an explanation for it. Just theories.
Yeah. Well, again, when it comes to the Beatles songs, I just think that no matter how much we read, no matter how much we learn, we'll never know everything. There
Sure.
are some authors that want to break it down. John wrote 85% of this,
Yeah,
15%. How do you know?
I don't buy that.
You
I
know?
don't buy that at all. They were influencing each other. They were inspiring each other. They were editing each other. You know, it's sure some of them lean more towards one than the other, but I don't know what's to be gained by giving, you know, doling out percentages to
Right.
each person in terms of who did what. That stuff just doesn't interest me, to be honest with you.
Right. But the one thing that most fans feel, and I agree, is whichever guy sang lead, that's the one who wrote most of the song, not all of it. There's a few exceptions though. Every
Right.
Little Thing is supposed to be a Paul McCartney song.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Day Tripper is supposed to be more of a John Lennon song, although Paul sang it and John said he struggled to sing those notes.
Right.
So he let Paul sing it. So you have those instances. Just talk about John and Paul's relationship. Would you say that was complicated or very? I mean, to me, I look at them as being very competitive.
Yeah.
But I think the huge difference, in my opinion, is that I think John gradually felt threatened by the competition, and I think Paul thrived on it.
I think John, not even gradually, I think John from the start felt threatened. He talked about, you know, how he felt. He was so impressed with Paul that he said, you know, this guy, I'm gonna have to really keep an eye on this guy. I'm gonna have to keep him in line.
Right.
When he let him into the Quarrymen. But I think John was more tortured by it for sure. And Paul did thrive on it. I think they had an incredibly complicated, there's that word again, complicated. And I think it definitely applies here. I think that I think Paul was one of the very few people that John actually did respect. Okay. I think, you know, and Paul obviously respected John, cared about John. And I'm talking about throughout the whole breadth and length of their relationship. I think that it sounds cliche, but I think they were brothers in a very real sense. I think that through their actions and just through the attitudes towards each other, I tend to think, I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying I think maybe Paul loved John more than John loved Paul. I think Paul stuck his neck out for John more than John would ever do that for Paul.
Hmm.
Not that he didn't, but I'm talking about to the extent.
Right.
I think that John was jealous and John was intimidated by Paul's talent, and he really let it get to him. And I think that Paul saw John as more of a friendly rival rather than, you know, a real threat. I think in some ways John saw Paul as a threat.
Huh.
And in the transcripts that have leaked out, and even in the I think in the Get Back documentary, in Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary, John is pretty much came out and said to Paul that, you know, I just kind of gave up, you know. And there was one point, I think during this was the post Abbey Road meeting,
right,
about 9 days before they broke up.
Yeah.
And John said, I just gave up. I'm just tired of competing with you. And you know what? Going forward, if we do another album, I insist that I have a certain amount of songs and you have a certain amount of, and he was just like kind of marking his territory, as almost if he was afraid that otherwise he wouldn't get on the album, which is crazy when you think John Lennon's not going to be able to get onto a Beatles album.
You know, I didn't read it that way, because
Okay.
what he said was, I get 4 songs, you get 4 songs, George gets 4 songs.
Right.
I think you said Ringo gets 1 or 2.
1 or 2,
But
right.
I think it had more to do with elevating George's status than anything else, because he sensed how frustrated George was.
Yeah, but I had a different read on it. I had a different read in that he got tired of jockeying for position with Paul on the albums, especially after Let It Be, where he was, you know, very honest about the fact that one of the reasons why they dug up One After 909 was that he could have a few more songs on the album.
Mm.
And so he was, I think, you know, to some extent he was still smarting from that. And I think a lot of it was because he saw that Paul was just a songwriting machine.
Right.
He was just coming up with this stuff left and right. And John was, you know, claiming his territory. I think that, you know, sure, I think he was looking out for George to a certain extent, but there's no doubt in my mind he was looking out for himself, and he wanted to have, you know, a certain lock on spaces on whatever next Beatles album there was going to be. Obviously there wasn't one, but I think that had a lot to do with it. I think he wanted to make sure that Paul did not dominate the albums.
Right. Very interesting. I know that John was very upset when he wanted I Am the Walrus to be the A-side for a single, and Hello Goodbye ended up being it.
Right.
And who could deny Hello Goodbye was a #1 hit, so commercial and just the right choice for top 40 radio at the time.
Right.
But in John's mind, I Am the Walrus is a better song, and you know, a lot of fans feel that way. But I'm sure he resented that tremendously.
He did. Well, look, I mean, a lot of the drugs he was taking really heightened his paranoia. I mean, that's the other thing that we can't sort of dismiss, is that, you know, a lot of the time his judgment was, you know, shall we say, maybe a bit impaired, you know. You know, he was acting to some extent as if Paul was out to get him, and the only crime Paul was guilty of in that particular context was he wrote a more commercial song. You know, he wrote a song that would, you know, probably sell better as the A-side.
Right.
That to me is not, you know, a capital crime. you know, I love I Am the Walrus. I think it's a fantastic song.
So do I.
But what's gonna sell more, you know, sell more singles? Sorry.
I agree. But you know, when I watch Get Back, I don't really see that aggravation in John. More so in Let It Be, I do. You know, there's that one
Hmm.
scene in Let It Be that I'm sure you know when Paul and John are having a conversation. Well, actually, John doesn't say anything. He's
Right.
just following what Paul's saying,
Yeah.
smoking a cigarette. He acts like he couldn't care less.
Hmm.
But and Get Back, they're getting along fine
Yeah.
to me. I
That was
don't
one of the
really,
big revelations of that movie,
yeah.
is just how they were getting along.
There's that one scene that I talk about all the time where it's on the day it was Elvis Presley's birthday,
Yeah.
and John and Paul are standing up and they're facing each other and they're singing right to each other and
Yeah.
they're looking at each other and they seem like they were in their own world.
Yeah. Hmm.
You know, that doesn't sound like, you know, what John said in Playboy,
Right.
end of 1970. You know, he had this image of Let It Be, probably based on the film of Let It Be.
Hmm.
It was a film by Paul for Paul, is what he said, you know? And it just so happens that Paul was so prolific at that
Right.
moment. He was a machine. It's incredible watching him. And at one point, Paul even asked John, "How many songs have you got?" And he said, "None."
Right. 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 Yeah. Hence one after 909.
Yeah. Well, he also at the time came up with "Don't Let Me Down" and "Big
Right.
and Pony," but
Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, it's a fascinating thing, and all the theories of their relationship, and then I got to give credit to you and Matt for this. It's always been a fascinating thing that I wish more people would talk about is Paul and George,
Hmm.
that relationship. And you know, I honestly have a tough time understanding why George had that big a problem with Paul. I mean, I could understand to some degree, but a lot of it is all theorizing, you
Hmm.
know. And what is your take on that?
Why George had this ongoing animosity with Paul?
Yeah,
Um, because he idol worshipped John. And when you
George did.
idol, George did, yeah. And when you idol worship somebody, they can drive you crazier than anybody, but you're also more forgiving. And I can speak from personal experience, um, where in terms of, and like the Beatles were like a family, like you said, and in my own personal experience, there are certain family members who I looked up to, who I wanted to be like, who I wanted to, pattern myself in many ways, and they drove me absolutely nuts. And I just kept coming back for more, and I just kept letting things slide. And there are certain other people in my family who had problems with, but not nowhere near. I didn't worship them the way I worshiped, the other person, and I really took a lot out on them. You know what I mean? I think that with George, um, I think he was willing to take a lot of guff from John just because he really looked up to John, and I think he saw Paul as more of a peer because they were friends
Right.
before the Beatles. And so now all of a sudden they're in this new kind of a situation, and Paul gets elevated. And I'm sure that Paul made it very clear that he's elevated,
Uh-huh.
and George is, junior Beatle. And that dynamic changed between them. Whereas John always had that sort of above kind of superior position to George. And I think in some ways, and again, I'm playing armchair psychiatrist,
Mm.
but I know how family dynamics work. And I think that with George, I think some of it was that Paul brought him into this loop, and then all of a sudden he was like above him, whereas John always was. So the dynamic didn't change. And so over the years, yeah, George let his distaste for Paul, or his not his not so much his dislike, because they did socialize. After they did start socializing again a
Yeah.
few years after the Beatles broke up. But George said some really harsh things about Paul publicly,
Mm.
that I think bothered Paul. I think bewildered Paul. Um, And I think that especially after John died, and George actually did say this, he said that, this was like particularly during the Anthology period, where he said, well, John's not here. So, I feel like it's up to me to sort of call out the BS, where I see it. And there was no mistaking the fact that he was talking about, keeping Paul in line, basically, because John wasn't there to do it anymore. So he saw himself as, he became the self-appointed, I got to keep him in line now. I'm not going to let him run roughshod over me. So you've got Jeff Lynne coming in to produce the 2 new Beatles tracks.
Right.
And you've got, George wanting to, create his own guitar part for Free as a Bird. And I think he wanted to play it on slide guitar. And Paul was a little, he didn't want it to sound like the Traveling Wilburys. And George was like, no, I'm doing this, So there was a lot of that. I think it got to the point where George has a real chip on his shoulder when it came to both John and Paul, but he displayed it a lot more publicly with regard to Paul. And the one of the best examples I can give is there are outtakes from the Anthology. If you have the DVD set of the Anthology, it's on there, where there's a scene where Paul, George, Ringo, and George Martin are in the studio, and they're listening to some of the Abbey Road tracks, and they're talking about Golden Slumbers and, Carry That Way, the whole medley on side 2 and all that. And George Harrison goes, what album is that on? And they all start laughing. And Ringo says, he points to George, he goes, you're George, I'm Ringo, he's Paul, right? And George laughs at that. And then Paul says, yes, noted Beatles scholar George Harrison, ladies and gentlemen. And George glares at the camera. I mean, it could cut it could cut glass. He'll take that kind of guff from Ringo. He'll take ribbing from Ringo. Right. From Paul, completely different reaction. And boy, I was like, I kind of did a double take. It was really interesting. Really interesting.
That's fascinating.
And it's there. It's there. Just watch it.
You could point to examples where John and Paul were not good to George at all, and not even really recognizing his talents. And George Martin too. George Martin admitted it. I've often mentioned that there's a quote that I've heard from George Martin where he said, the first time I ever realized George gave us a really good song was Here Comes the Sun. Which really? That's the first time. Yeah. I mean, and I love bringing this up, but I've done this in my podcast. You take something as complex and brilliant as Within You, Without You. And George Martin did the score for that, for the strings and for the Indian instruments. Is he not realizing how brilliant George Harrison is in writing this? I've seen George Martin praise that song very highly. I mean, really? Oh, absolutely. Okay. I've seen him. There was one interview where he said that George had pitched a song for Sgt. Pepper's, and he didn't say which song it was, but it's one of the songs that ended up on All Things Must Pass. Only Northern Song. No. This was a song that ended up on All Things Must Pass. Oh. It might have been. It might have been. Isn't it a pity? But I don't want to. Well, it was written. Yeah, he said it was long and he said it was long and monotonous, and he told George to come back, and he said, and he came back with Within You, Without You, and it was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Okay. So he did praise it. I think he might have just misspoken when he credited "Here Comes the Sun" with the first great song that that George contributed. Right. Maybe he mixed up the chronology, but no, I've seen George Martin praise Within You, Without You very highly. Good. Yeah. Send me a clip if you find it. I will. Yeah, I will. I would love to see that. But yeah, it's an interesting thing. around the time of Cloud Nine, I think. It
Hmm.
might have been on Aspel and Company on TV, where George looked into the camera
Hmm.
and said, "I love Paul."
Hmm.
You know, he used those words.
Hmm.
So,
And I don't deny it.
yeah,
I don't deny it. Like I said, they were socializing on a friendly basis. I think when Wings was on tour, um, George went to see him play, and I think that on the Dark Horse tour in '74, Paul went to see George play.
right.
They socialized. They were on good friendly terms, which is why it was a shame when George made that comment. Uh, I'd be in a band with John Lennon again in a heartbeat, but
Hmm,
not Paul McCartney. How is Paul supposed to take that? You're saying
right.
it. You're saying it to a member of the press. You know it's going to get out there.
Hmm.
Um, what kind of message was he trying to send? Because that is sending a message. And it's a weird one to send to somebody that you're allegedly getting along with,
Well,
Um,
you could love someone as a person and just not want to work with them.
sure, sure, but between
Yeah.
keep that between the two of you. You don't have to tell millions of people out there.
Right.
Um, but there's no doubt that there was love between them. They went through a very, very rough patch. They went through numerous rough patches,
Hmm.
including one of the things that I talked about in my book was the when Paul was the no-show at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction.
Right.
And I wish I had the room to get into it, but I just didn't because we're so limited for space.
Right.
I would have liked to have gotten into George's reaction, the some of the interviews that he gave in the aftermath, where he talked about how he felt about Paul's no-show. Um, but there were rough patches. That was one of them. Because that was around the time that George, Yoko, and Ringo sued Paul because he was getting a higher percentage of the
Royalties.
royalties because that was part of his new contract with Capitol Records. They lured
Right.
him back from Columbia. So that was a deal that Paul made separately, and they felt they should have been on it. And Paul's reaction was, "We've been broken up for 15 years. We're not partners anymore. I don't
Mhm.
have to, get your own better deal."
Mhm.
But they sued him. And so, yeah. But obviously in the last few years of George's life, certainly around the time of Linda becoming sick and passing
Right.
away, um, I think a lot of the stuff that was between them kind of fell by the wayside, and I think that they did they mended all of the fences at that point. I mean, George, who was, I think he's battling cancer himself at the time, attended Linda's memorial service, and of course we know that Paul was there for George at the very end.
Right.
So there's no doubt that there was love between them, no doubt. But it
One-
was a tricky relationship.
Yeah. One thing that I have trouble agreeing with is this idea. I hear people say that because of the financial problems that George had with Handmade Films, that's the reason why he was in the Beatles anthology. I think that no matter what, um, if he was the richest musician on the planet or the poorest musician, he would have been there because he'd want to tell his side of the
Right.
story,
Yeah.
and he was proud of those years. Um, and he also would have looked very bad if he didn't show up.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the anthology had been in the works since the late '70s. John talked about it in his last interviews.
Hmm.
I mean, that's the thing. It was originally going to be called The Long and Winding Road,
Right.
and it got shunted to the side in the late '80s because there was still a lot of contractual stuff that was going on between the Beatles. They weren't, agreeing on a lot of things. So it got put aside, and then it got put on hold even more. My understanding is because Yoko decided to go ahead with the Imagine John Lennon documentary. And so the desire was not to have the two projects basically competing for attention.
Mm-hmm.
So Beatles Anthology, Long and Winding Road got delayed. And then once all of the legal stuff between the Beatles finally got resolved, we're now talking in the late 80s,
Mm-hmm.
they started to move forward. And it wasn't just going to be a simple documentary movie anymore, which is originally what it was going to be. It was just going to be a documentary movie, probably 90 minutes, maybe 2 hours tops.
Right.
And then they decided to make it into this whole big thing that it became. George's insistence was that it not be called The Long and Winding Road, because he didn't want this whole thing to be that about the entire Beatles history to be tied to a Paul McCartney song.
You know
Okay.
that for a fact?
Yeah. That's been well reported.
Mm-hmm.
The sense that I get is that George was always going to be a part of it. A reluctant participant, maybe, but he was always going to be a part of it. But what I think it had been in the works. It had been talked about for years. I mean, I'm not exaggerating. Years and years and years.
Yeah.
I think we got it when we did because of George's financial difficulties. I think that probably spurred it on, made it more of a priority than it possibly would have been otherwise. Maybe we would have got it in 1998 instead of 1995. Whatever year we got it. But there's no doubt in my mind that George was always going to be a part of it. Mm-hmm. I think the impetus to get it done when it got done finally was because George had hit a rough patch financially. But yeah, there's no, I don't believe that otherwise he wouldn't have participated, or that it wasn't going to get done at all. I don't believe that.
Because yet at the same time, everyone points out that he doesn't look too happy at times when he's, jamming with Paul and Ringo. He hardly ever smiles.
Right.
It's almost like he's forced to be there. So
I think look, you can agree to do something, and do it because you feel it's the right thing to do. I mean, how could George not participate if Paul's in it, Ringo's in it, they're using clips of John? How could he not? So you can willingly participate, but still not be 100% happy about it. And I think that George was, he never got over being uncomfortable around Paul, going back to the late 60s. And what he felt was being bossed around and dominated by Paul. I think he never quite got over that. I think that, and I know the clips you're talking about. Those are the bonus scenes on the DVD, where there's a point where they're going to do Blue Moon of Kentucky, and Paul says, "I do that in my concerts now." And George is like, "Let's do a short version." He just can't he can't wait to get it done. I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot to that. I think maybe at that point it was towards the end of the day, and he was like, "You know what? I've had enough of this. Okay, I'm done. I've reached my threshold of reliving the past." And unfortunately, he wasn't great at hiding it.
Right. I got to tell you though, it always struck me as rather odd, and I'm not the only one that said this, that when George died, Paul's comment was, "I lost my little brother."
Yeah.
He didn't say anything like, what a great guitarist he was, what a great songwriter he was, and I'm sure that you can look at that quote there from Paul as being rather affectionate, endearing on the one hand, but never praising him for his talent.
I don't seem to recall him being too effusive about John in that respect either when John died. I mean, we're getting past the drag, isn't it? Part. But when he finally did issue a full statement, I don't remember off the top of my head, but it wasn't anything like that either, if I remember correctly. You know, I think that, first of all, Paul has always said he's terrible at this kind of thing.
Yeah, I know.
He doesn't mourn in public. He doesn't let that side of him out.
Mhm.
He's basically been that way since his mother died. He never handles these kinds of situations particularly well. He's not a speech maker. I mean, even when he's asked to, prepare speeches and give induction ceremonies to colleagues and friends or whatever, and he does write a speech. It's usually not a very good speech,
Mhm.
but it's heartfelt. And I think that him saying he was my baby brother, uh, that's about that's about as good as it gets from Paul. I think he thinks that how much more can I express? I loved him like a brother, and
Mhm.
let other people talk about what a great musician he was. To me, he was a brother, and maybe he feels that that's enough.
Good point. It's very easy for things to get blown out of proportion in the
Hmm.
eyes of fans around the world, and
Yeah,
even among DJs and podcasters too.
sure.
So we're all guilty of it at times.
I give people a lot of leeway when it comes to how they deal with death. Everybody mourns in their own way, so I don't judge people based on their reactions or their statements. I mean, if he said something completely ridiculous or off the wall, maybe I'd feel that way, but I feel he's entitled to say what's coming from his mind and his heart about somebody that he obviously had a lot of affection for.
Right.
And and I felt the same way when his reaction to John's death. If you watch the clip and you see the reporter was being really obnoxious with him,
Mhm.
I probably would have, I certainly wouldn't have been as polite as Paul was to the guy. But you could see he was getting annoyed and he just wanted to get away from the guy. And it became, it was so blown out of proportion. And thank goodness that, now you could just go on YouTube and actually see the clip, which
Right.
when I was, 10 years old and saw the comment in cold black and white print, I was like, wow, that's the best he could say. When you
Mm.
see the clip, it really tells a different story.
It's kind of strange in a way when Paul has the time to give a little speech of some kind when someone passes away. If it's someone that he's not extremely close to,
Hmm.
it could be very elaborate. I can remember when Phil Ramone passed away, and he wrote something really beautiful about Phil Ramone.
Okay.
You know, um, a few other people as well. Taylor Hawkins. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
wrote some beautiful words about Taylor Hawkins.
Hmm.
If it comes to someone like John and George, it's probably way too tough for him to say everything he wants to say. And certainly in the case of John, shove the microphone right in your face right
Right.
after it happened, you know.
Why did you go to work? Well, because I felt like it. Why? It's almost like it's almost like he's in a he's on trial,
Right.
for making a decision to go to work that day. It was
Mm.
just the guy put him on the defensive. Anyway, so that's but yeah, he's got a track record of not saying things that he has a track record of not saying or mourning or reacting the way people feel he should. You know,
Right.
I remember when Linda passed away, everybody thought that, oh, the next album he puts out is going to be this heart wrenching. It's going to be the most powerful album he ever put out. What did he put out? An album of mostly cover songs.
Right.
And it was a great album,
Yeah.
terrific album. He never put out the "I'm Mourning My Beloved Wife" album. You
Right.
know, and I know that disappointed some people. But you know what? He's put out some great albums since then, and he has the right to.
Right. All right. Well, why don't we wrap things up
Sure.
and let's talk about Paul, the perception that the general public has of Paul today. I think he's so respected and revered,
Yeah.
because of his entire history, not just the Beatles but his solo work as well. Every single review that I read of his concerts are glowing.
Hmm.
Um, and it is really very heartwarming for me, and I could be just as critical as I can praising the man, because I would love for him to shake up his set list a lot. That's my
Hmm.
biggest problem with it, with his tours. But when you go to concerts and you see the widespread of ages there, from
Yeah.
grandparents to kids, some of them seeing Paul for the first time, and they're loving every single second of it, and the reverence that they have for this man, it's wonderful to watch and observe, and that's as much a part of the concert as the performance at this point for me. um but I just think he's a marvel for everything that he's done, and the fact that he never stops working and creating. And I think more and more people admire him for that. He's weathered the storm. He's survived all this criticism. you know it's pretty remarkable what he's been through.
I get into that in my book, to a certain extent. And one of the other things that he's been great at is keeping himself relevant, not just by just, putting out albums and touring, but also working with the current generation. The song he did with Dave Grohl and the other members of
Right.
Nirvana,
Mhm.
working with Kanye West and Rihanna,
Right.
and it's a damn catchy song,
Mhm.
and I'm not a big Kanye or Rihanna fan, but I like that song. Um, Posing on the cover just a few months ago of Rolling Stone with Taylor Swift,
Right.
and doing a whole interview with her. And he's been very supportive of the generations of musicians that have come after him.
Mhm.
They revere him. That's another important thing.
Right.
And he interacts with them, and he's he's one of them, and so he's managed to remain relevant. That video that he did a few months ago, the one that I can't remember the name of the song, but they used the animation to make it look like it's Paul from 1965 dancing in the hotel.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Well, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. It's no, it's Find My Way,
Find My Way.
the Beck
Yes,
version.
yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
And so he's still pushing the envelope in that regard, and
Yeah.
putting out stuff that people take notice of. I thought I couldn't take my eyes off of that video. It was
Right.
amazing. So he has managed to maintain a relevance that nobody else I can think of off the top of my head. Even Mick,
Hmm.
hasn't quite been able to do. And just keeping the music out there, and putting out new stuff that is getting noticed. It's remarkable. And I mean, 80 years old. I mean,
Right.
it's amazing.
Well,
He's old.
It's getting noticed to some degree, because as someone who's been in radio for a long time, they're not likely to play 80-year-old artists or 70-year-old artists, especially to a young demographic. But
Right.
certain formats of radio will play him, and for like a short period of time, as a sign of respect that he has a new album that's
Hmm.
out. It's not like the airplay he got in the 70s during the Wings
Sure.
days, or even in the 80s for that matter. But yeah, I see what you're saying. And it's kind of funny. On the one hand, you're talking about how he would talk to producers, how many number ones have you produced? And yet he could be so grounded that he can have a conversation or try to relate to young artists of today
Yeah.
and support them,
Yeah.
and do something like get behind McCartney 3 Imagined,
Hmm.
all the artists on that album.
Yeah.
So it's two different sides of Paul right there. So like you
Yeah.
said, he's complex.
Yeah. I was gonna do a call back myself to that.
Mhm.
Yeah. It's Howard Stern, I think, referred to McCartney as our, the Beethoven of like the 20th century. You know,
Right.
like just a once in a lifetime, or once in a, someone of that monumental stature. And I think that's a great way to describe it.
Oh, I agree totally. You know, I think about all the great songwriters of the pre-rock era, the Irving Berlins, the Gershwins, those kind of people, Cole Porter. You know, I think Paul's had a career longer than they have, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and he's still continuing. And, you know, we know that he's been working on this musical of It's a Wonderful
It's a Wonderful
Life.
Life. Yeah.
He's got an animated film in the works, High in the Clouds, and I'm sure that he's going to be making another album and putting out another archival box set. There's so many things that he's active at, and
Yeah.
then he tours.
Right.
And, you know, it's remarkable that someone his age is this active. You know, it's remarkable if he was 50 and he was this active.
Well, that's the funny thing is in my book, because it's published with the Time brand,
Right.
we had access. The one thing that I didn't write in the book
Yeah.
was we used an interview that Paul gave on the occasion with Time from the archives on the occasion of his 50th birthday. That was a big deal. Paul McCartney turns 50. That was 30 years ago. I mean, think about that. And he's still doing it, you know. I mean, that's what's so amazing. You know, I mean, his life has changed in many ways since then. But the fact that he's still doing what he was doing when he was 50, 30 years ago it's amazing to think of. And where I feel very blessed to have grown up during a time where I could enjoy his Beatles stuff in retrospect, because I was too young,
Right.
but I could be there for decades and decades of his new stuff and hear these great, incredible songs as they were coming out, not as a relic from before I was born.
Right.
And I feel very lucky to have been able to experience it.
And the great thing is, it's not like he's dried up.
No.
He's still cranking out good music. He still has this amazing gift for melody. And I was just remembering, because you're talking about Paul at 50. By the way, is the entire article from that time in the new issue, or is it?
It's the whole thing. It's the whole piece.
The whole thing.
Yeah.
Okay. But you can remember that interview from 1963 or 64 with the Beatles, and they're interviewing each of them, and John is saying, we could be big-headed and say we're going to be doing this when we're 30, you know? You know, it's...
I remember he gave a quote. This was when I was a kid. Boy, we're talking 1977, 78.
Yeah.
And I think the question was, will you still be doing this when you're 64?
Right.
And Paul's response was, oh yeah, sure, just a little slower.
I don't even know at this point if he is slower.
Right.
But all right, well, Glenn, this has been a joy talking with you.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
Once again, the issue is from Time Magazine, Paul McCartney at 80. It's available at, let's see, Walgreens, ShopRite,
yeah,
I think. And you can get it on Amazon, right?
You can get it on Amazon, like you said, Walgreens, ShopRite, Stop and Shop, Barnes and Noble.
Okay.
You know, I'm trying to think. Dwayne Reed, Rite Aid, the CVS. Yeah, it's pretty much out there. But obviously, if you have trouble finding it, the easiest way is to just order it from Amazon.
Okay. Yeah. So let's all keep celebrating Paul's 80th birthday. Let's all keep celebrating Paul in general. And thanks so much, Glenn, for spending time here on the channel. And thanks to all of you for watching. And we'll see you next time.